Hello, I'm Eve Levin,
I'm Margaret Phillips.
and we are the grandnieces of Jacob Levin, who was a homesteader in Cherry County in the first part of the 20th century. So we came here to Omaha to the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society in order to find out more information about our great uncle and his family. Um, so we've been hearing stories about him all of our lives from, from our father, Saul Levin, who was his nephew, and from our grandfather, Nathan Levin, who was his brother, and from various other relatives. And I actually had a conversation with Jacob Levin in 1974 when he was in his 90s living in Silver Spring, Maryland. And he told me some stories then. We've also found information and written sources. We have Jacob Levin's own speech from his 100th birthday, and we have a narrative that was written by our uncle, Peter Levin, who was Jacob Levin's nephew. And we don't know exactly when it was written, but he seems to have done some research and collected a lot of old stories. Should we talk about ourselves? Okay, I am actually a historian myself. I am a professor of Russian East European history at the University of Kansas. So I'm accustomed to doing historical research, but not usually in this period or this place.
I'm Margaret Phillips. I live in Norman, Oklahoma, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Public Health. And I'm mostly the driver and the reader.
Since I can't read right now, I had eye surgery last week, and the doctor won't let me read, even though there's lots of good stuff here to read.
But we have, based on a book that was published about the Nebraska Sandhills, we have more or less identified where Uncle Jake's claim would have been in Cherry County. He led a group of immigrant Jewish socialists to Cherry County to take advantage of the Kincaid Act. So he had a claim of 640 acres, and he was in partnership with his brother-in-law. He filed the claim in 1908 and proved up, got the patent, stayed on for 2 years.
Do you know where he came from?
We do know where he came from originally. When he moved to Cherry County, he had been living in Milwaukee, which is where quite a lot of the family had settled. But he was actually born in a place called Sitnia in what's now Belarus, near the city of Mosir. So from what I've been able to figure out, Sitnia was a Jewish agricultural settlement, and we've learned that our great uncle's father had a farm there, actually maybe even two farms, although he made his living primarily by running a livery stable and a hauling service, taking passengers from the ferry to the train station. So we know that our great uncle Jacob Levin was trained as a metal worker, and for a while he was living in Yekaterinoslav in Ukraine, which is where he met his wife, Rivka, and married her. We also heard stories that he was active in the Jewish Bund, which were the Jewish Social Democratic Organization in pre-revolutionary Russia, which was, at the time he was a member, which must have been 1903, 1904, it was an illegal organization. So the story he told me in 1974 was about how he came to America. And this is a completely different story than our uncle, Peter Levin, recorded in his memoir. But I will tell the story as Uncle Jake told it to me. He said that he was living in Mosir, and he was a member of the Jewish Socialist group. And one member of the organization died of tuberculosis. So since they were allowed to have a public funeral, but they weren't allowed to have any other sort of public meetings, the organization decided that they were going to have a demonstration in connection with this funeral, and they wanted somebody to speak. And they asked Jacob Levin to be the one to speak because, as he told me, he spoke well. I surmised that that meant he spoke well in Russian. I know he was fluent in both Russian and in Yiddish, but he didn't say exactly that. In any case, he spoke at the funeral, he said, but he knew that whoever spoke at the funeral was going to be arrested. So he had asked originally to be excused from doing that. He said that he had a wife and he did not want to be the one to be arrested. But he spoke because he said the party wanted him to speak. And immediately after the funeral, he said, he fled towards the border, hoping to cross illegally. Well, at this time, people who were coming from the Russian Empire who wanted to leave the country had to have a passport or some document that was like that, and in order to indicate that they had permission to leave the country. He tried to cross the border without that. It's unclear to me whether he was trying to cross the border into Germany or into Austria-Hungary. He didn't tell me that. But I know from the work that was done by one of my graduate students that the border crossings into Germany, they routinely checked for whether the people crossing from Russia had proper exit visas, and my uncle did not. And in any case, he was turned back from the border and was arrested. What he told me was that the convoy of prisoners started heading back into the Russian Empire, into Belarus, and they stopped for the night in Sitnia, where some sort of relative, an uncle or a cousin, was the mayor. So Jacob was identified by the local mayor, and the mayor made a deal with the local police chief. The local police chief was going to get a new galvanized steel bathtub, and our great uncle, who was a trained metal worker, was released from the prison convoy to install said bathtub. Uncle Jake told me he was good with his hands. So that was how he got released for the prison convoy, and apparently in exchange for his services rendered, he got a valid looking exit document, and he once again left for the border and left Russia that way. Our grandfather, who took the name Nathan when he came to the United States, he was Nahum back in Russia, left probably quite soon after that. He was 6 years younger than his older brother Jacob, and according to our family tradition, Nathan was eligible for the draft. This makes sense to me that he would have been eligible for the draft. The oldest son might get an exemption, but not the younger sons. And so he left. When Nathan left the country, the family arranged for him to travel under an assumed name with another family. My dad says it was the family's name was Katz-Nelson, and they had a valid visa for one family member, a son-in-law, who was not able to go. So our grandfather, Nathan, posed as the son-in-law in the family, came to the United States with them, entered the country under that assumed name, and then left the Katz-Nelson family and made his way on his own, but we're not sure exactly how he ended up in Milwaukee. Whether it was because his brother Jacob was already there or not, we have no information about that. Do you remember anything else?
No, the only thing that I remember being talked about, aside from the general fact that Uncle Jacob was a farmer, was I remember hearing people, and I don't recall who. I think it might have been some of the great aunts. So Jacob's sisters, because the whole family came over eventually. But I remember talk about Jake's children, Edith and Louis, going barefoot. So this was about the hardship of living on the claim in Cherry County.
Yeah, and I remember some stories my father heard from Edith. He knew Edith very well. As Edith, who was Jacob's daughter, lived with my father, Saul Levin, and his family when he was a boy
In Chicago.
In Chicago, she became a school teacher, and she's the one who taught our dad French, and he eventually became a professor of ancient languages, classics, and linguistics. So he got his start early from Edith. But the story my father heard from Edith was that when Edith went to school in Nebraska, I think it might have been when they were in Omaha, but at that point she spoke primarily Yiddish. And the story he told was that the teacher held up a card with a picture of an apple on it and asked the children, "What is this?" And Edith said, "Apple," pronouncing the word in the Yiddish manner. And the other children laughed, and Edith was mortified that the children were laughing at her. And according to my father, she decided at that time that she was going to get rid of any remnants of a Yiddish accent, that she was not going to pronounce English in the way of a Yiddish speaker, even though that was her first language.
Do you know anything else about Jacob? He came here and he was a homesteader, I assume.
Yes.
And he did farm. Is that correct?
He ranched. They
had a ranch out
yeah,
there,
yeah,
right?
They had about 70 head of cattle and 15 horses, and evidently one way that he got income was by hauling. So he had draft horses as well as riding horses.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of the other family join him out there?
Yes.
There's a story in the memoir from our uncle that we've left with you about Jacob's father, so our great-grandfather, David Arya Levin, coming out for a visit from Chicago. And this is something a story we had never heard.
Yes. It's in our Uncle Peter's memoir that he written, that we've left a copy of here.
And so we know very little about our great-grandfather.
Mm-hmm. But you think he joined Jacob
he
in
visited,
Cherry
came
County?
out for a visit.
Okay.
There, I don't know. Shall we tell the
yes.
the story? According to the story of the memoir, at some point, Jacob's father learned that his son and Jacob and his partner and brother-in-law were raising pigs and butchering them and smoking the meat and eating it and feeding the trafe to the grandchildren. And there was an enormous blow-up, which the the little grandson, Louis, I guess, remembered all his life.
Yes. So when Jacob apparently went out to look for the land and to lay the claim himself, by himself, or with the other, some of the other Jewish men, including, I guess, his brother-in-law, but they tried to get things set up and get a house built. Apparently it was a sod house, though we're not sure how that worked in the Sand Hills, whether you could build sod houses. That's something we have to find out. But they built a house, and then Jacob's wife Rivka, whom he married in Russia, Yekaterinoslav, and their two children, Edith, who was born in Russia, and Louis, who was born in the United States, came out and joined Jacob on the claim in Cherry County. Now, our father said that the family, that Rivka and the children would spend the winters in Omaha, but the memoir that our uncle wrote says that Jacob also would spend winters in Omaha, trying to have a chance to supplement the family income by doing metal work and that kind of thing in Omaha. And that was part of the way that he was supplementing his income in order to be able to develop the claim.
Do you have any idea how long he stayed out there?
Until 1916, according to the best information we have. We haven't been able to actually find when he sold the land. But he did manage to actually develop it and get title to the land, which apparently most of the Jewish Kincaiders were not able to do. And according to the records we've seen, it looks like all of the Jewish Kincaiders who settled in Cherry County were gone by 1916, and that only two of them could be traced by the Jewish Agricultural Society, which had provided them with some loans. And our best guess is that the two that they could find included Jacob Levin and probably his brother-in-law, because they were the ones.
What was his name?
Louis Offengenden.
Okay.
And we think that they were the ones who the Jewish Agricultural Society could still trace, because it said in the published text we found about the Kincaiders, just a short passage, it said that the Jewish Agricultural Society knew that they had moved to Michigan, which is actually where our great uncle had moved after he sold his ranch in Cherry County. He went back east. He wanted to live closer to family in Chicago, also have a place where his son and daughter could go to school, and he ended up buying a farm in southern Michigan, a dairy farm, where he lived throughout his adult life.
What happened to his children?
Both of his children ended up going to school, and they both graduated from high school. Then they went to Kalamazoo College in Michigan. My father has told me the story about how Edith had to, when she went to high school, she had to board during the week in town, and her father would come to pick her up on Friday afternoon so that she could return to the family and then take her back on Sunday. But so it was really important to him that she should be able to get an education. And I assume that Louis did something of the same, unless they built a high school closer in between, since Edith was the older child. So she went to Kalamazoo College in Michigan, and she told me the story once about how when she was a student there, she had gone out on, I guess it must have been a Saturday night with friends, and the friend's car had a flat tire, so she was late coming back to college for the curfew, which was, for a young woman, at that time. This must have been, I guess,
1920s.
about the early 1920s, I guess. Well, for her to, not come back for curfew was an offense for which she could be immediately expelled from the college on suspicion of misconduct. So she came back, and she told me that she had to wake up the house mother for the dormitory, who was very, very short with her about this. And she said, this is where I was, this is who I was with, this is their telephone number, they can verify it. And apparently the house mother humphed some. And Edith waited to be expelled. Soon thereafter, she received a note from the president of Kalamazoo College asking her to come to his office. So she expected to be expelled at that point. So she came into his office, trembling. And the president was very cordial to her, said, "Miss Levin, please be seated. I would like to talk with you." And she was wondering, well, when is he going to tell me that I've been expelled? And he was talking to her, and he says about her family. She says, "Your family does not have a lot of money." And she said, "No, they did not." And she was wondering where this was going. And then he said, "We know that your brother has applied for admission to the college, and I'm happy to be able to tell you that we will be able to give him a scholarship." So instead of being expelled from the college, she was just being notified that her brother was admitted and that he was going to get the scholarship. Now, I've since wondered why she didn't get the scholarship, since she had already proven herself as a student. But then I think that they didn't give scholarships to girls when they could give them to boys. So she ended up graduating from college. She became a school teacher in Chicago, and I think eventually she became a vice principal. Lewis ended up graduating from college, and then he went to graduate school. I think he earned a PhD, and he ended up working for the National Institutes Health
Or National Science Foundation.
Something, maybe National Science Foundation, and that was his career. So both of Jacob Levin's children ended up getting advanced degrees, getting college degrees, and in the case of his son, a doctoral degree.
Is there anything else you can add that would help our archives about Jacob and his?
Well, he was an ardent socialist.
Okay.
From his youth. The story I heard about how he became a socialist is that it was actually his sister, Minnie, who was the first one to get involved. And Minnie how she became a socialist, we don't know. She was sort of rebellious, and during a lot of her life, we remember her when she was old. And Minnie, the story I heard was that this was of course back in Mosier, that Jake was just stopping in at, I guess it must have been an inn or a tavern or something like that, when he was hauling things for his father. And a back room of this inn opened up, and people came out, and one of them was his sister. So he wanted to know what his sister was doing there in that inn, and she told him. And I guess she was persuasive, because all of the brothers and sisters who were old enough, I think all of them eventually ended up identifying as Social Democrats. And their parents remained religious people, but they were not. And I remember from my sort of earliest memories when I was maybe 5 or 6, and we went to Chicago, and there was a family gathering. I remember my grandfather and his brothers and sisters arguing about politics, and it wasn't American politics, it was still Russian politics, because when the Russian Social Democratic Party divided, it split up into different movements. The family seems to have split too, and some became communists. Our great aunt Pearl was actually a member of the Communist Party all her life. A nicer little old Jewish lady you never found. She was very generous, you know, wanted to feed everybody, but she was a communist. And I think Minnie was pretty adamant also. Our grandfather ended up turning to the right, and he became a liberal Democrat. And Jake, I don't know how he identified politically later on, but he always used the rhetoric that he learned in his youth of social democracy and wanting to speak up on behalf of the working person.
I heard from my mother that when Jake was in his 90s, now retired and living in Silver Spring, I assume to be near his son Louis, but he would go and protest in front of the Soviet embassy in support of Jewish refuseniks.
That sounds about right. And his sister Minnie actually went back to Russia apparently in the 1960s as a tourist and wanted to have a chance to meet with some cousins who they'd remained in contact with, and she had apparently a chance ultimately to meet with them, though their addresses have subsequently gotten lost and I've never been able to find them again. But she went back and got to see the Soviet Union as a tourist. I don't know what she thought of it, whether she saw enough to see that things were not as good as she might have thought. The other thing about Jake is that in his retirement, he took up the hobby of doing mosaic pictures. And almost all of those mosaic pictures were on Jewish themes, particularly Old Testament themes. Our father has a mosaic that Jake gave to him that depicts Moses in the burning bush. And we also have in the family a mosaic of a man at prayer with his prayer shawl that might have been Jake's memory of his father. I know when I visited him in 1974, he showed me a mosaic that he had done, which was of his mother as he remembered her blessing the Sabbath candles.
Anything else you want to add to from your research?
Well, it's something that we learned from Peter Levin's memoir of Jacob's sojourn in Nebraska. That's worth pointing out. He came to Nebraska as a blacklisted working man, probably pretty close to broke. Mm-hmm. And he left after he was proved up on the claim and was able to sell it and sell off the livestock. That is, he left Nebraska with $4,000. So he was able to go from being an unemployed, blacklisted, albeit skilled worker, to a person who was able to buy a farm in Michigan. So he was a success story, even though he did not stay in Nebraska, and he certainly was very proud of what he accomplished here, and it was the central focus of the speech that he gave on the occasion of his 100th birthday. So I think the adventure of living in Nebraska was one of the highlights of his life.
We do know that for our cousin Edith, his daughter, it was not a good experience, that she did not like living on the farm, that she found it very isolating. And I think that was true not only of the claim in Cherry County, Nebraska, but also even in Michigan, that she really hated being on the farm, and she was going to be a city girl. And that's how I remember her, that she was the city girl, and that she was not going to go back to rural life. I gather that Lewis had had experiences that were more positive. Of course, he was the boy.
Yes, younger and a boy.
Younger and a boy, and probably allowed to run freer than Edith was. And I think that I suppose the other thing about Edith is that, in addition to the fact that our father knew her really well because she lived with the family, I knew her a little bit better also. She was the family spinster in that generation, the woman who decided not to marry. And in my generation, I'm the spinster. I'm the woman who decided not to marry, and Edith was my role model for how to do this. We can tell a little bit more about the family in case people come looking. Lewis had 2 children, David Levin, a son, who received a PhD, and when I met him, it must have been in the 1980s, he was a professor at the University of Chicago.
In physics.
And he actually confirmed the same story that he heard from his grandfather, Jacob Levin, about how he left Russia. So at least my cousin David and I actually had the same story from Jacob, but we're not sure that whether it's, we never know whether this is absolutely true. I think it probably is. And there was a daughter also named Miriam, who, when she married a man by the name of Leventhal. So she became, instead of being Miriam Levin, she became Miriam Leventhal. I met her once, and it must have been about 2002. She was then living, I think, near Detroit, and my parents had come. I was then living in Columbus, Ohio, and my parents had come out to Ohio for an academic conference. My dad was participating in that was in Toledo, so I joined them there, and Dad's cousin Miriam came down from Michigan, and so I met her once. She brought with her son Jeff, who was, I think, in his early 20s. So we, I was able to establish that. Of course, my dad knew his cousins very well because the cousins would get together very often at Uncle Jake's farm in Michigan. So my dad remembers going out there very often as a child, and how much he liked being out at the farm. I think was because it was different from the city.
Did we say how many years that you think that Jacob was in Nebraska?
Yes, it would have been 7
maybe 7
yeah,
years.
about
Okay,
7 years.
okay.
So he filed the claim in 1908, and had and then left in 1915 or early 1916.